Here we go. How do you say your last name? Shull?
Shull,
Okay.
yeah.
Veronica Shull, welcome to the Modern Puritan Podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excited to be here, honored, and humbled.
It's really interesting how this came about.
Yeah.
You emailed me literally out of nowhere saying that you you appreciated the podcast, and then right off the bat volunteered that your fiance is in the last few years of a federal prison sentence.
Yep.
And that somehow so you've been listening to the podcast, but then he also has been able to.
He's not been listening to the podcast. So he gets the catalogs for Reformation Heritage Books.
Yeah.
And he also, I think, has probably written to you guys and requested resources. I could be wrong about that, but he, I guess there's a promotion in the catalog or it
That's
could
right.
be.
The last catalog, we did have ads for the Modern Puritan Podcast and our other one, which is the All of Life for God podcast. So he probably saw those.
Yeah. So he saw the ads and was like, you need to listen to this podcast. So I said, okay, I'll check it out. And I listened to one episode and I was like, I don't know if that's something I want to listen to, honestly. And then,
Do
yeah.
you want to share what it was?
I listened to the first one that I listened to was with Leah Savis, and I was kind of like, I think what it was is I wasn't used to the format. So podcasts that I listened to were usually like sermons or news.
Yeah.
So it was a very different format that I hadn't yet kind of come around to. But then I listened to, I think the second one that I listened to was the one by Stephen Nyland, and was like, whoa, this really has affected. Because evangelism is something that Samuel and I discuss often. And we have this perspective of the church is meant to be the place where people go to seek the Lord. And so Stephen Nyland really just kind of like blew that up and was like, yeah, I stand on a street corner and preach the gospel. And he's actually had several debates with a man that was previously his cellmate, who's like one of his best friends.
Samuel has. Yeah.
And is now out. Sorry. Yes. And so he and I have discussed that in those conversations, and his former cellmate. And I've kind of talked about that too. And so I was like, this is a podcast that like he would really be, contribute to that conversation. So I sent it to his old cellmate, who is out and is able to listen to podcasts regularly. Okay. And so it's like, hey, check this out. And explained like, here's what I'm thinking. Reminds me of some of the conversations that you guys have had. And so,
how did he respond?
He was like, yeah, I'm thrilled about this, because he's very much about street evangelism and and like preaching street corner preaching. And so it was like, this is exactly what I've been saying all along, And so for him that was helpful. But then I was like, I really would like to get this resource to Samuel for him to be able to hear what he has to say.
Yeah.
So.
I love hearing about these guys who, like Stephen, who was, in a combat zone and had a pretty kind of, I guess you would call it, gritty life in the Army. And then this gentleman you're mentioning who went through federal prison, and then these guys come out of that context and they go to the street and they start preaching. It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's such a amazing conversion story. It's like the Lord, I know there's people who do street evangelism that don't have that kind of a gnarly background, but these guys who do, it's kind of like, okay, yeah. It's like they're almost, not that they're unfazed, but they're able to they have this resilience that I think has been developed from those experiences, that they can just go on a street corner and preach.
So part of the background of my story is at one point I was involved in a street evangelism ministry. And so like I saw kind of like a very much, we would go out and it didn't look at all like Stephen Nyland's ministry. And I think that was what my aversion to street preaching was. I had gone out with groups of people actually in Southern California. And we would go to these events and show up. And it wasn't an area where our church was able to reach out to these people. It was like usually 45 minutes to an hour away from where our church was. And so going out and preaching the gospel, which I don't regret at all. Like, I think that the Lord uses that in a lot of ways, but also recognizing the importance of the church and recognizing the need for the follow-up that was overwhelming to me, that's what Stephen's doing. Is his ability to just follow up with the people that he's ministering to was the importance. And I think that's the aversion oftentimes to street preaching, is people are not following up. And that's an unfortunate reality. And I was part of that. And so that was where I was like, not sure about street preaching. But but as you hear, like, people are following up. That's
I think it speaks to the need for like a corporate or team effort with evangelism, where often I think the perception can be, well, that's the street preacher guy.
Yeah.
You know, you're a little bit on the fringe and you know, you have this boldness, or I guess some people might make the excuse like, oh, they have the time to do that. Whereas I don't, because I work and I have kids and I have all this. Yeah. So does Stephen, you know. Yeah. But the fact that, you know, if that is his primary role, is street preacher, if that's what God has called him to, other people need to step in and help support that. Maybe they don't have the boldness to be out there preaching in the same manner, but being the ones who provide that follow-up and help support that ministry. Like, it's more than just giving money to Stephen or other street preachers. Like, oh, here you go. Use this to support your family. It's like, well, great. Well, who's going to support the new family? The new brothers and sisters of Christ who come into the church before they get snatched away, like the parable of the sower, right? They get snatched away by charismatic influence, by maybe even heretical types, like prosperity gospel stuff. You know, things that are like Christian-ish.
Or the moralistic ideas.
Totally. Like you told me, like the whole legalistic type movement. And instead of coming to faith through a guy like, I'm just using Stephen as an example, or let's say other solid, like Reformed, experiential preachers who are out on the street, and then sadly they don't get more of like an infusion of that type of doctrine. Because
it's very easy. Because actually, I should say I was not the one who was preaching. I should make that clear. Like, recognizing that, yes, as a woman, I probably shouldn't be. But I was there as kind of like to hand out the tracts and to follow up if there were, you know, women in the group that wanted to have a discussion. I was there to do that. But oftentimes you see like this life-changing experience for people, but then you don't follow it up. And I was just, especially like, I guess Southern California, there's a lot of churches that I don't necessarily think that they have the greatest theology, right? And they're not, the Reformed context I don't think is very big out there from what I've kind of seen and heard. I mean, you probably have more experience with that, but.
Well, I'm from Los Angeles, so I kind of know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And well, I mean, if you think about there were some significant events there in church history that happened, such as like the Azusa Street Revival, the Vineyard Church started there.
Right.
All these, like the charismatic movement began in Southern, in Los Angeles. Downtown.
So,
and then from there spread. So the influence there is still very, very strong.
And so I think it can be really easy to if you just let that happen. But it's really great to see that Stephen is doing like such a wonderful work. And but that was a failure, I think, on my part to really be consistent and to follow up with the people that I had met.
Right.
And then I think that easily allowed them to fall into dangerous theology. But
so are you from California originally?
No, actually. So I grew up in Michigan. My parents moved to Michigan when I was 7. But when I was 21, on my 21st birthday, I moved to California to go to Calvary Chapel Bible College. So I grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, which is very different from Reformed theology, very the opposite, just like holiness, very moralistic. And so, but then I met someone who was affiliated with Calvary Chapel, ended up at Calvary Chapel Bible College, graduated from there with a degree in theology. and then ended up at a church that was affiliated with John MacArthur, actually. And so I had a lot of friends who went to Masters, and that was the church that I was evangelizing with. But yeah, and then I moved back to Michigan after a few years and was with my parents for a while. And then went back to school for engineering, actually.
Okay.
And then in my last year of school at Lake Superior State University, which is where I went for a degree in mechanical engineering, is when I met Samuel. And then after the Lord provided me a job where I could work remotely, I was able to move down to Texas to be with him.
I see.
Yeah. So kind of been all over the place a little bit.
You covered a lot right there.
Yeah. Sorry. we can delve into whatever you'd like, but yeah.
Well, you've got 2 Masters alum in the room right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. You heard Abby went to Masters University.
Okay. I was not aware of that, but that's okay.
Yeah. And I went to the seminary.
Yeah. So I knew you went to the seminary, but I wasn't aware that. Okay.
We have 3 Masters folks in here.
Yeah. Well, I'm not by association, maybe, I guess, but actually, and that was part of Masters actually does play a part in the story of how Samuel and I met. Let's get to that story in a minute, because I still want to, I want to hear a bit more about your story leading up to meeting Samuel. Yeah.
So, you go out to California from Church of Nazarene, but to Calvary Chapel.
Calvary Chapel, yeah. So
I was in a Calvary Chapel for a long time.
Yeah.
In LA.
Okay.
After university, so
still
have a lot of like good friends in that, I guess, church context. Yeah. And I would have to say that even when I was in Calvary Chapel, it was Metro Calvary Chapel, which is in Santa Monica.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know if it's around anymore, but it was instrumental in my growing as a Christian.
Mine too, yeah.
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 But then that's just the way the Lord works sometimes. It's not like, to say it bluntly, like you must be reformed or you're not fully Christian.
Yeah.
The Lord is more gracious than that. He puts us on this kind of path. Yeah. At least I know he did for me and for others as well, to bring us to just a deeper, more profound, and I guess we would say here at RHB, like experiential understanding of who the Lord is and what he's done in history and in our own lives as individuals. So is that similar for you? Like you're at Calvary Chapel Bible College, but then you said you met some people from MacArthur's church.
Yeah. So actually what happened was while I was at Calvary Chapel, so it's hard to, I guess, articulate a lot of, there's so much happened that it's like, it was all the Lord just drawing me closer to himself. But my final semester of Bible college, I had been listening to a lot of John Piper, and just was like recognized the doctrines of grace in my last semester. I went on actually a mission trip, like a short-term mission to Watts, LA. And while I was there, the trip was put on by a couple of guys who were also aware of the doctrines of grace and were like adamant, like Calvinistic, and kind of we were kind of a little bit of a thorn in the side of the administration of the college, because we're over here promoting Reformed doctrine and they're like, no, we don't want that here. And so we called ourselves, we had like some nickname, something about Czechs and Calvinist, and it was a whole big thing. At my final semester of Bible college, it was me and 5 other people, I think. We all just kind of like, we're adamant about the doctrines of grace, and we're like, no, like God chooses us. It's not like we don't choose God. Like we're totally depraved.
What year was this?
This was 2014.
Was this before or after when Chuck Smith was basically like, Calvinism is not, like if you're a Calvinist, you got to get out of the Calvary Chapel system? So he really dropped the hammer at some point.
It was probably after. Chuck Smith died in my 3rd semester, I think, of Bible college.
Okay.
So I think that was the end of it was probably October, I think, of 2013 he died. So I think he had probably put down the hammer at that point.
Yeah.
But I do know something I know there was a lot of tension about Calvinism. There was a guy that was teaching at the Bible college who is now actually part of, somehow affiliated with Masters Seminary. And he was teaching at the Bible college, and a lot of the students were kind of starting to see the merit of the doctrines of grace. And so he actually was asked to leave the Bible college shortly after I left, I think, as a result of just like not doctrinal. The alignment wasn't there, and so he was asked to leave. But he was actually from the UK and came over to teach at the Bible college. So it was kind of like really crazy story.
Okay, interesting.
But, yeah.
What? How important was it to you to have a group of others who were in that same kind of mindset?
It was, well, I wouldn't
especially in a context like Calvary Chapel.
Yeah, I wouldn't have known that I was Reformed until someone said,
"Oh, interesting."
Like, hey, because I was actually growing up in the church that I did, had a discussion with the pastor of the church at one point, and he basically told me, I'm not really sure the language that he used necessarily, but he was like, Calvinists are evil. Like, and you shouldn't believe, like we have free will, and this is like, if you believe that God is sovereign over all things and over salvation, then that's not right, basically. And so I was under the impression, and believed for a long time that free will was like, like I choose God, and like I need to have that choice. And so, but then as I'd been listening to John Piper and being influenced by his preaching, then eventually I came to realize the doctrines of grace, but didn't know that I was realizing them until someone said, "Oh, you're a Calvinist." And I was like, "No, I'm not. I can't be." But then someone pointed out in scripture to me what I was saying, and was like, "This is the doctrines of grace. Like, you have to understand." And I was like, "Oh, I guess I am." And then I went through a really bad cage stage, and it was pretty nasty.
I think we all do that.
Yeah, which I was like, as the more I talk to people, the more I'm like, okay, everybody goes through this, or a lot of people go through this. We're just proud of ourselves, which is so ironic.
Yeah, I mean, but maybe, I don't know. I remember it differently.
Okay.
Maybe I'm too kind to myself, but I was sending emails to friends and calling them out, and they're like, "Dude, what happened to you?" You know?
Yeah.
And then I had to apologize later and be like, "Yeah, came on too strong, sorry." But everyone's been super gracious and not. Well, I guess some of my unbeliever friends were like, cut the cord kind of thing.
Yeah,
it's like, you're too much, you're out.
Yep.
But when you find something that is so true and biblical and comforting and assuring, I guess would be a really good term. It's hard not to tell people about it.
Yeah.
And I guess you're right, be proud about it. But again, it's ironic, isn't it? It's like, if we do believe in God's sovereignty, then we didn't come upon this ourselves anyway.
Yeah.
But it's hard to like hold your tongue about it.
Well, and I think especially after, like, it's such a big deal. It's like and you've come out of believing that you're the one who made the decision anyway. So it's hard not to be proud, like, and not to like continue a train of thought that you've believed. For me, it was, I think, like 5 years that I had been a Christian before, or no, 6 years that I had been a Christian and believed that I had done the choosing of God, right? And so it's hard to kind of divorce this idea that I've chosen God, or like I realized the doctrines of grace myself, right? But and so I think over time you start to see like, oh yeah, that's not me. But initially it's really easy to just be proud of yourself.
Yeah.
So
I know for like my personal journey, and I've talked to other people with the same feelings, but you kind of come off of that high a little bit, but you reach this really good place where there's an acknowledgement of mystery. So I think this is something I was talking about with Ian Hamilton. I don't remember, but how there's just things we just won't know.
Yeah.
So there is a sense in which we assent to the gospel. We choose to believe, and yet it's prefaced by God's sovereign choosing of us. So in that kind of like
tension.
Tension, that crossing is this mystery that, again, we just have to acknowledge to the Lord, like, I don't know. I don't know why you chose me. I don't even really understand how. Like, we know it's the Spirit, like in Ezekiel 36.
Yep.
So the bones being raised up and flesh being put upon them. You know, I like to think of it in those terms.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned in an email to me actually about how Samuel really wants to see the movie Cessationist.
Yes.
There's an amazing, have you seen it?
I haven't yet.
Okay, so there's this amazing sequence in there that I think Les Lampier, who's the editor, producer of it, he does this like heart of stone into flesh being infused into a person.
Wow.
Kind of, it's not CGI, but it's that kind of a thing. It's amazing. It really represents visually, you know, something like what happens to us when the Lord saves us.
Yeah.
So
the image of that it's cultivating in my mind is beautiful. So, yeah.
Can you look that up, Abby? Yeah. It's on their,
Is it on the website?
I think if you go to Reformed Pub, shout out to Reformed Pub, by the way, on Facebook. But if you go to Reformed Pub, and you might even just be able to scroll down to it, but if you do search Cessationist, you'll see their graphic. So you discover the doctrines of grace, which apparently have been operating in you already by this point.
Yeah.
And then this is towards the end of your time at
so it was
Chapel Bible College.
My last semester of Bible college, and the friends that I made on that mission trip who were like, we're Doctrines of Grace people, like they were affiliated with a church that was with, or they went to a Bible study actually, that was run by a church that was affiliated with John MacArthur.
Do you remember the name of the church by chance?
I do. Faith Bible Church.
Where?
In Murrieta. So it's Chris Mueller is the pastor who may have been in
I know
your
that
life.
name.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because you said that you went to Grace Community.
So actually,
When you were young,
I was born at Grace.
Okay.
And
well.
I mean, you know, metaphorically.
Yeah.
But my mom had just started attending there.
Okay.
My parents had just started attending there. I was born a few months later.
Okay.
Then we were there throughout most of my childhood before I went to high school.
Okay.
But then I came back to Masters for my MDiv.
Right. Okay. So he was, Chris Mueller was there in the 80s and 90s, I think, if I remember correctly. He was like the youth pastor there for a long time.
Yeah.
And then started the church in Marietta.
Okay.
So.
Okay. That's why the name is probably familiar. Let's see. I was there from 2010 to 2013 for seminary.
Yeah. So I started in 2012 is when I started Bible college.
Okay.
So 2014 is when I started attending Faith Bible Church.
Yeah.
And was there for 2 years, I would say. Yeah. I moved back in December of 2016 is when I moved back to Michigan. So.
Your move back to Michigan was prompted just by finishing school?
No, actually, I graduated in 2014 from school, and I stayed out in California because I felt like that was where the Lord wanted me to be at that time. And there was a lot of things that happened. I actually attempted suicide in April of 2016 and was hospitalized for 10 days. And the Lord used that as a kind of like people started to realize there's more going on in my life. I needed more help from the church. But I think they didn't know how to help me. And so they said, we think that you should probably go home and spend some time with your family and kind of figure out what's going on. Like, we don't know how to help you, and maybe your family will. And so they asked me to go back home. In a gracious way, I think. At the time, I didn't see it that way. But looking back, I see like the Lord was working in that and really.
Yeah. But did it feel like a rejection?
It did. Yeah. It was a really hard season. Because I was like, I'm struggling, and you're asking me to leave, and I have to leave all my friends, and these relationships that I've established. But I see now, like, there was no way that I could have stayed there and probably thrived, just because I needed to be in a place where, because I wasn't, I think a lot of it was that I just wasn't comfortable. Like, I wasn't, I didn't trust anyone. And I wasn't willing to be vulnerable with the church, which I see now as, and especially knowing Samuel, like, and have learned that vulnerability is like pivotal to our relationships. And I didn't realize, but I was unwilling to do that. And so because I was unwilling to be vulnerable and to share, like, these are the things that I'm wrestling with in my heart, no one knew how to help me. And so it was a rough kind of time. But the Lord brought people into my life when I moved back to Michigan, which is how we used Masters Seminary, actually.
Really?
So when I moved back to Michigan, knowing that I was going to be heading home, also recognizing, like, I need to be in the body of Christ. I looked up on Masters, their website for their alum.
Yep.
The closest church that had a Masters alum was 2 hours from where my parents lived, on the west side of Michigan. And so I think it was New Year's Day, I drove. It was like there was like a snowstorm, like icy roads, really dangerous. But I was like, I'm doing it. I'm gonna go. I drove to this little church in Curran, Michigan, which is like this. I mean, like, I think there's like 100 people in this town. I mean, like, it's tiny. Like, there's maybe a flashing light or something that you drive through and it's gone. But I drove over to this town and I walked in the service, and it was at 1:00 in the afternoon. And I was like, this is kind of weird. What's going on? But I walked in and there were 8 people in this little church. And I was like, what is going on? So it turned out the pastor, who was, I think, an alum of Masters, had left like a couple months before. The church ended up dissolving a few months later. But while I was there, a woman who was the director of a camp, which actually the reason I'm in Michigan right now is I went to her daughter's wedding. But she said, my daughter lives in Petoskey, which is 20 minutes from where I grew up. She said, you need to meet her and you need to go to her church, because I had explained, like, I'm looking for a church, looking for community. Had just moved back into town. And so she connected me with her daughter, and she and I became like best friends, basically, and like went to her church. And while I was at that church, I met a woman named Heather, and Heather and I became good friends. Heather was going through just some difficult times, and I was able to minister to her family. And in turn, she was able to minister to me in a lot of ways too. Yeah. And she was writing to Samuel. So she's actually the woman who introduced me to Samuel. So
really?
Yeah. So.
Okay, because I really want to hear about that connection, but let me touch on a few things you just mentioned. Yeah. So, so I'm assuming that when you came back to Michigan, you didn't really have anywhere close to the support network that you had in LA or Southern California. In terms of, like, you'd been there for what, 4 or 6 years?
I'd actually only been there, like, at the church for 2 years.
2 years. Okay, but enough time to establish relationships. And although you admitted there was a lack of vulnerability on your part.
Yeah.
But I would say that, I mean, gosh, that's hard for all of us.
Yeah.
I would say almost especially in the church. That's a whole nother topic we could talk about.
Exactly.
Vulnerability in the church.
Yeah.
Not just for the lay people, but also leadership. Yeah, let's set that aside for a minute. And then, but the other thing is this, is that you keep using this word ministering, like you were able to minister to this woman, Heather, is that right? And then who was the other one?
Oh, her daughter.
The daughter whose wedding you went to?
Yeah, her name is Naomi.
Okay, so you all are able to be ministering to each other. And I love that we're talking about this, because we mostly have men on this show. And I had a conversation with the Reformed pastor in town this past week. We were talking specifically about this, about how men and women engage with men and women differently.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of ministering to each other. So here's the question I wanted to come to, is that Do you feel like your experience with the attempted suicide, and that coming after discovering the doctrines of grace, which is very interesting as well, not that should keep anyone from suicide, because anyway, that's a larger discussion as well.
Our bodies are broken.
Right. Yeah, we are broken. We are still living in a vessel of sin, right?
Yeah, bodies of flesh, for sure.
So, but do you feel that whole experience enabled you, or equipped you is a better word, for the ministry that you had, or maybe even still have with Naomi and Heather?
Yeah, I would say I had more compassion for people, I think. I think that recognizing what I needed in that moment and not having that to the extent that I felt I needed it was...
You saw what other people needed.
Yeah. I saw in myself what I needed to offer to others around me through that. And I like the Lord was gracious in teaching me compassion through that, which I think is how I ended up with a man in prison. I think, but I also think the Lord has gifted me in that way. Even before, I mean, my whole life, I think I've had kind of like a compassion for people. But how that looks has changed over time, and been shaped by my experiences, obviously. And I think this attempted suicide, and there were actually, I should say, there were people who were there who were able to show me the compassion that I needed, but they weren't in leadership. And so the leadership is the ones who made the decisions. And so I still have actually a couple of really, really good friends who really cared for me during that time. And they came to see me in the hospital like multiple times and were willing to just drop everything in order to help me, which was just huge. And I think was how I was able to keep going and how I was able to continue to like trust people in the church.
Yeah.
Despite
that's amazing.
The pain of and I know that's God's grace, because there's no way that I and myself could overcome that. Because it was a dark time when I moved back and was like seeking out that community. And it was hard, but God was so gracious to me in it. So,
Can I ask you a really tough question?
Sure.
So, why do you think that having an understanding of the doctrines of grace was not able to prevent you from attempting suicide?
It's this whole thing of, and I've wrestled with this a lot actually, because I'm like, I believe in the doctrines of grace, so why can't I? Like, I believe that God has saved me, so why can't I just not be depressed anymore? Because I have wrestled with depression my whole life. I actually had 2 previous attempts when I was a teenager as well, and so after discovering the doctrines of grace, I believed, I've passed that area of my life, right? And have overcome that, and so it's no longer an issue. And then it was. And now, as the older I get and the more self-aware I become, I guess would be the word, I realize a lot of it is just a lack of understanding of the root of my depression is often anxiety and not understanding myself. But it's often my unbelief. Because even though I am saved and even though I am like recognize that my salvation is not in my own works, but in Christ and the work that he's done, and my foundation is him. There are moments when our eyes are off Christ. And so he still holds us during that time. But as believers, we can have moments where we're not necessarily focused, and there's idolatry that occurs, or there's, like our eyes are taken off of Christ. And a lot of the experiences that I've had in my life in recent years have shown me that even though we are believers and that we love the Lord and we can pursue him with all our hearts, but there are moments where life just throws stuff at you that you're just not expecting. You're like, Lord, what's going on here? And then we just get selfish. And I think part of it too is just this idea that we are dichotomist. I have to often say that in our discussions, and I'm like, I had at one point been taught we were trichotomous, and he's like, no, we're dichotomous. You need to get that. But recognizing that we are we are body and soul, and our bodies are still broken. Our bodies can often affect the way that our mind works. and vice versa, right? Our minds can affect the way our bodies work. And so when we recognize that and see that, as we still live in bodies of flesh, there's still the temptation to allow our bodies to rule and our flesh to rule. And I think, and that was ultimately what my suicide attempts were, and the depression that I was experiencing. And I think it's different for everyone. But I know a lot of people also who struggle with depression and this reality that, like, they wonder, like, why do I feel this way? Like, I'm saved. Why can't it just go away? Like, don't we have joy in the Lord? The reality is, yes, we can, but we're not glorified yet. And so that wrestling is still going to occur for us.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Thanks for answering that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I know, especially from being in the military, I know plenty of guys who have struggled with that.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, even though they're believers, this sometimes the things they've been through and just maybe they've been dealing with some other things like depression or whatever has put them at the verge of suicide. Yeah, thanks for answering that. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing I was kind of wrestling with as I was thinking about being on this podcast, I was really wrestling with, like, there's going to be some, like, there are hard things like that are part of my life, and knowing that there are things that are going to come up from my story. But I'm reminded too that, like, my life is not my own. Like, I've been bought with a price. And that's something too that I've just been thinking about with Samuel, and our, like, Lord willing, our marriage is to be that. And that's something that we discuss often, is just this idea that, like, our life, our marriage, our everything is for God's glory. And so if I'm able to share and minister through what the Lord has done in my life, like, then why wouldn't I do it? So
that's a beautiful perspective. Yeah.
It's a hard one sometimes, but yeah.
I have to confess, since the theme of this podcast is authenticity, that's what we strive for, at least. Yeah. When I was in LA before I met my wife, actually, and I was a Christian, but I had one, if not two moments, standing by the bed, gun in hand, ready to do it. I don't know why I didn't. I can't remember now what pulled me back.
God's grace.
But yeah, definitely that. But something entered my head of, like, not now.
Yeah.
But it was in thought of not now. It wasn't like never.
Yeah.
So.
And in that moment, that's all you're going to listen to is not now, right? Like, like it's not. Yeah. Often our brains can't function past that next moment. And so.
Yeah. Like when you're in that.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I hope our little discussion here is helpful to people, because I think that we've had a few people on this podcast who are in various, I would call it streams of, like, counseling within the church.
Yeah.
Including those who take more of a psychology-based approach, and those who take more of what we would call, like, biblical counseling approach.
Nuthetic,
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
The Nuthetic approach. And it's my belief that there are far more people in the church that have struggled with thoughts of suicide, like legitimate thoughts of suicide, not just scenariizing, which I think I would actually count as kind of, well, not that it would manifest as someone actually attempting it, but it's just it's a symptom of something much larger, which is what you've talked about, actually, that we're still in these broken vessels. And it's a strange thing, isn't it? Like, we long for the return of Christ, and in a way, as perverted as it might sound, it's like, oh, maybe I can hasten that.
Yeah.
By just I could be before the Lord now if I do this thing.
Yeah. Well, that's the wrestling of Paul in Philippians 1, right? Like, just it's better for me to be with Christ, but here I am for you. So.
Yeah. I guess what pulls us away often is this remembrance that it's not just, I'm not just called into the family of God to be Christ's only brother.
Yeah.
You know, it's me and Jesus. It's like, no, actually there's a whole family.
Yeah.
And we are called a body.
Yeah.
And so if I take myself out of this life to be in the next one, the body loses an appendage or a part of its necessary,
function. Yeah.
function. And so, I don't know. I wish that there was more tangible hope. Not just that, but also vulnerability on part of people in the church who would just be like, I just, like, I'm hurting. I need help. So on the one hand, there's that vulnerability, but I think actually what the bigger problem might be is a lack of people in the church to be like, I'm going to help you.
Yeah.
I'm going to make myself vulnerable and come alongside you and help you.
Yeah. And even if, this idea that even though you don't understand, because a lot of times people are willing to help, but they don't understand how to help. And so they try to help you in a way that is not helpful.
Can you give examples?
So I think about oftentimes, if I'm depressed, sometimes I just need someone to come and sit with me. I don't want to talk about what's wrong. Like, I don't often know. Like, if I'm depressed, I don't know what's happening. I just know I'm depressed. And sometimes it's helpful for people to just come over and let's play a game together. Let's not talk about our feelings. But people want to.
Right.
And I think in a lot of ways there has to be some grace in that too. But there's also like the platitudes that people offer, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I know their hearts are right in offering that, but sometimes you don't have the whole story of what's going on. And you say things and they're not helpful, and sometimes they can do harm. Like understanding, I guess another example might be just like telling someone they're in sin because they're depressed, when in reality it's a hormonal imbalance that's occurring. Like there's brokenness and it's like, what are you doing that's sinful? And then you rack your brain. Like I have a very strong awareness of my sinfulness. Like that is like a bent that I have, is like I recognize a lot of times I'm more prone to see my sin than I am to see grace sometimes. And people will often say like, what sin have you committed in order to be this depressed, right? I'm like, I don't know. Like,
is that like Christian karma?
Yeah, I mean, and that's ultimately like what it sounds like a lot of times, but people don't realize that that's what's actually what they're communicating, because their hearts are right in it. And it's totally like because they care so much about us and they want to see us happy and joyful and like the joy in our face, right? They want us to be excited about life. And sometimes life is not exciting. And so sometimes it's better to just be in the presence, or when I'm depressed, sometimes my apartment turns into like a sty, right? Like you're just like dishes are piling up and there's, like papers everywhere. And it's like, sometimes I just need someone to come over and help me like clean my apartment. And we don't have to talk about the fact that I'm deeply depressed, but there's, and that's not, I hope I don't sound like I'm complaining or, like accusing anyone of anything. Cause I recognize that people are trying and they do it out of care. And so I'm so grateful for the people that are around me that have, taken the time to care for me. But sometimes that's like, it's sometimes, and I think that's part of why people are not willing to put themselves out there and into a vulnerable position, is because sometimes people don't respond the right way and they don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Maybe,
Or they don't feel equipped.
That too,
which is a weird thing, isn't it? Because the main thing that those who are depressed, and I've struggled with depression over the years too, and COVID was really hard for me.
Yes.
And I had my wife around, my kids around. I mean, I remember the things I was writing in my, I don't keep a journal, but I'll do writing sometimes, just written prayers or just write. I'll write to think.
Yeah. To get it on paper. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it'll be, pages worth of stuff. And I remember like it was clear, like it was yesterday, but I wrote in my notepad, I'm so explicative lonely. Like that covered the whole page.
Yeah.
That was during COVID. That was like the middle of COVID when we had the lockdowns.
Oh, yeah. And in Michigan, it was like worse than other places too.
Yeah. And I don't usually use explicatives.
Yeah.
I sure did in the Navy.
No,
but
I understand.
But it was so hard. And so I think for people that are trying to minister, like who really want to minister to those who are struggling with depression or other issues like that, like the one thing that you just need is, well, you talked about it, empathy.
Yeah.
You don't need to go to biblical counseling courses. That might help. You don't need to have your Bible memorized. You know, that might actually be a hindrance, just throwing Bible verses at people. But just like
a Band-Aid.
Just go and like be there. Yeah.
Just presence. Yeah.
I got a dog that helped me a lot.
Yeah.
No, I'm serious.
No, I believe that. There's so many studies out there that show.
I think he like saved my life.
Wow.
Yeah. Big Max. Anyway, let's not talk about my dogs and I'll start crying. Okay, so you're back in Michigan and you God brings these two women to you.
Yeah.
You become good friends, vulnerable friends.
Yes. Yep.
And
vulnerable, yeah.
Sorry?
It's very vulnerable, yeah.
Yeah. And then you're introduced to Samuel. How did this come about? You said Heather was writing to him?
So Heather, I mentioned Heather had been going through just a difficult season in her life. Actually, as soon as I moved to Michigan and met her, there was some things that happened in her family that were just very difficult. But she had also just started this ministry with her husband, her brother-in-law, and this Catholic priest. And they had a ministry to Catholics.
Who imprisoned Catholics?
I think so. It's still unclear to me, kind of the whole. But I know Samuel found a pamphlet from her ministry and wrote to her during actually the same time that I met her. He had started writing to her. But during that time, she started writing to him. She and I started hanging out quite a bit and just spending time together and just doing life together, right? And so then I went off to school about a year after I met her. But when I would come home on the weekend, I came home almost every weekend for 2 years. And then my last year, I didn't come home quite as much. But when I would come home, I'd try and make a point to see her. And we'd go on walks together and talk. And she would drop little hints of like, oh, this guy that has been writing to me has been so encouraging. Like he's just really loves the Lord. And, like she'd say things about him that were just very uplifting and very encouraging. And I was like, I'm so glad that this man is so encouraging to her, And at one point, I think it was probably a year or so before he wrote me a letter. She was telling me a story about him. And I was like, man, I wonder if this guy's single. I was like, surely he's not, because like a man like that who is just so in love with the Lord and is so able to like minister to her, like would not be available, and just like, but yeah, so she, I guess, was also telling him about things that are happening in the church and had mentioned me a few times to him. And he was lamenting his singleness at that time with her. And she had become kind of to him a spiritual mentor. And so he was kind of expressing like, I'm going to be single forever. I don't know what I'm going to do when I get out, and just like I desire to be married, but he is a sex offender. And so that in itself can make it difficult to meet people and to get involved in the church even too. And there's a lot of complications with that, but he, so he was telling her this, and she wrote back and she was like, well, I know this girl. He says she described me as intellectual, reformed, and full of grace. And that was her description of me. And he said, I'm going to marry that girl. And so he said, can I write her a letter? And so he wrote me a letter and he gave it to Heather. And she delivered it to me kind of out of nowhere. It was right before I was about to go back to school for my final year of engineering at Lake Superior State. And so she handed me this letter. She said, this guy, like, I think he's a great guy. Like, I've been writing to him for 3 years. He wrote you this letter, like, no pressure, like, here it is. And so the letter was basically like, my name's Samuel Condo. I'm here in prison. I love the Lord. I heard, I lead all these Bible studies. I'd love to get to know you. I'd like to be friends and correspond. So if you're interested, like, you can give a letter to Heather and she can send it to me, or if you wanted to, but I ended up actually just writing him directly because I was like, oh my goodness, this guy's single. Just because the things that I'd heard about him, I was just so impressed. And that he had written to me, and just like the things that he said were just so saturated in the Word of God. And I was so impressed by him. He's like, I love Martin Lloyd-Jones. And I was like, oh yeah, he's great. Like, I had read Sermon on the Mount, and he kind of mentioned, I think he mentioned that in his first letter or something. But he said he loved to read books. And so I asked him, I think I asked him what kind of books he liked to read. And of course, he's very well read. And so he came back with a lot of books. But so at that, and then, oh man, I think we corresponded for maybe 3 weeks. And he said, can I get your phone number? I'd like to call you. And so then at that point he called me on the phone. He actually had to call me probably like 20 times, because up in Sault Ste. Marie, like, you're on the border of Canada.
Okay.
And oftentimes my phone, while I was in classes, would roam. It would go to like the towers in Sault Ste. Marie. And so I'd have to have my phone in airplane mode when I was at school. And so he was frantically calling me, and I was like, yeah, I had my phone on airplane mode. So eventually I answered the phone, and he was like, hey, like, yeah. And it was just so sweet being able to chat with him. But, yeah. One of the first books we read together was Rosaria Butterfield's. Her book. I think I read Openness Unhindered first. Okay. And then I read that one because he had mentioned that in one of his early letters. He said, this book is incredible. And it really helps me to understand just the tangles of sexual sin. And for him, like, as a sex, like, he's in for like sex, he's a sex offender. And so like, that's part of his story is wrestling with that. And so it was really sweet to be able to read a book that so clearly is compassionate and yet true. Like, there's truth and grace in that. And then we read Secrets of an Unlikely Convert as well. And I think we started to read The Gospel Comes with a House Key, but didn't get through that one because I was in engineering school and my semester just, went crazy. So how were you reading the books together? So he was like, just get the books. And then I would read it and then give him like here's what I think about the book kind of thing. Yeah. So. And this is mostly through letter writing. Yeah. And some phone calls. Yeah. So actually most of our book reading together is through letters and then like phone calls, because phone calls are limited. So it's 15 minutes and he gets 500 minutes a month. And so it's a very limited. In fact, and that's part of the story too, is what the Lord used. When we first started talking, actually like a few months after we started talking, we were establishing like, okay, I'm interested in marrying you. Like, this is a serious thing. Like, we both knew almost immediately, like, this is the person that God has for me. And so, he was nervous when we first got together. He has a pretty jaded past, I would say. I don't know if I can say it that way. Just some difficult things in his past that have relationships that were hard. And so he was really nervous that I was not in it for the long run. And so he would call me all the time and use up all his 500 minutes in like 3 days or something like that. And so then he resorted to using other people's minutes. Like we have a friend who doesn't really have a whole lot of family on the outside. And so he doesn't have a lot of people to talk to. So he wasn't using his minutes. He said, you can use mine. Yeah. And they actually ended up about 1.5 years ago, they got in trouble for it. Which was God in his grace, right? He disciplines those he loves. Yeah. And it it catapulted our relationship in a lot of ways, but we didn't talk for 3 months because his phone minutes were revoked for 3 months. And during that time, we also didn't have a visitation because it was still kind of during COVID. And so I didn't talk to him. We had letter writing for 3 months, which was kind of like, well, we're just going back to the beginning, right? But but at that point, our relationship had developed to such a point that it was a difficult kind of 3 months. But
it seems like such an arbitrary rule, the phone minutes.
Yes.
Like some person sitting in a room thought that would be a good idea.
Yeah. And actually before COVID, the reason that they have 500 minutes now is because of COVID.
Oh.
It used to be, I think, 300 minutes that they had, and then they increased it because they didn't have visitation rights during COVID.
So that's like, that would have been 10 half-an-hour phone conversations during a month?
So each call is only, it actually is about 8 hours, I think.
No, I mean, before it went to 500.
Oh, yeah.
It used to be 300 pre-COVID.
Yeah. But they only get 15-minute phone calls.
Right.
So,
and I was making the math easy on myself.
Okay. So, yeah.
So
it'd be 20 phone calls, yeah.
No, 10. Oh, that's right. 20 phone calls.
Because they get
in a whole month.
Yeah. That's actually, as you put it that way, I'm like, wow, that is pretty.
That's just almost nothing.
Yeah.
Like you could do that in a day in most jobs.
Yeah. Yep.
Abby does.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
So how would you say the relationship was able to develop with just correspondence? Meaning correspondence at a distance. And have you ever been able to visit him in person? Yeah.
Okay. So actually, the relationship developed over correspondence. I think grace was really just, being able to communicate. And just, I think we were able to prioritize the things that we talked about, and to say, we talked about meaningful things, I think, and it caused us to have to reflect on where our values were. And when we saw that those aligned, which I think was really easy to do, because the things that we talked about in our writing were the things that we cared about, and just recognizing that alignment. Plus, I think part of it was our friend Heather just knew that we were perfect for one another, and she saw our values as well, and recognized that we both had a passion for theology, a passion for ministry, and just passion for the Lord. And I think those things.
And she'd already corresponded with him for about 3 years at this point, so she had a pretty good understanding of him. And she and I were doing a Bible study together as well, so she knew what I believed, because the church that I was in at the time was not Reformed. Was just a little Baptist church, like I'm preaching the word, but would not doctrinally line up with where I'm at in life. But it was what the Lord had for me and what the Lord used. And that was the church that she was going to as well. So she knew kind of where I stood theologically, and she recognized that it aligned with where he stood as well. And I trusted her judgment as well. And also that's something that Samuel talks about often is the Puritans. This is something that we've talked about was the Puritans used to say, like, you have the parents come in and approve, right? Like who you're going to marry. And for Samuel, Heather was kind of like a spiritual mom to him. Yeah. And so that was kind of like our story, is that we actually had someone who was like a parent who vetted, our spouse for us. Right. Yeah. And so like, we see that as the Lord was working in that. Yeah. But then I actually was able to visit him. He wrote me the first letter in August of 2020. And then in January of 2021, I flew down to Texas from Michigan, and visited him for 1 hour. That's it? Yes. That's all they give you? Yeah, 1 hour. So my sister lives in Austin. Yeah. He's in Fort Worth. So I flew down to Dallas. I did a 1 hour visit with him. I met a man named Peter Yoder, who was very good friends with Samuel through correspondence, actually. Like they corresponded for several years, and then he also went to visit him during that time. And
I got to meet him. He was at actually RTS in Dallas. And so I met him while I was there because Samuel was like, you got to meet my friend Peter. Like, he's a great guy. Like, would love to have him like meet you and see what you're like. And, was just really excited to share me and to share his friend with me, like just that bringing people together.
Yeah.
So he was excited for that. And then I went to see my sister and then flew back home. But yeah, and I did that. And then in May of that same year, I flew down and I was actually able to see him twice. It was 2 1-hour visits in May of 2021. And I also met his parents that month.
Okay. Are they down in Texas?
So they're in Oklahoma. So I drove from Dallas to Tulsa and met them, which was challenging in some ways. I'm just like, hey, I'm this stranger just coming to meet you, but I love your son. So
yeah, and he's not there.
And he's
it's just you and the parents.
Yeah, so here's meeting the in-laws again.
That's very awkward.
Yeah,
I can imagine.
It was fun, but they're great. They're great people, so it wasn't too bad.
Are they believers as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Samuel has had a huge impact on their faith as well.
Really?
Yeah, they Samuel grew up in the Assemblies of God, and so they were in the Assemblies of God until 2017 when Samuel got saved and said, "Listen here, you got to read R.C. Sproul."
Well, that's a jump. So Assemblies of God, from what I've heard, can be quite moralistic in its teaching.
Moralistic, extremely charismatic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not Sproul.
Not Sproul. And so, so he grew up in that, but he was not a believer during that time. And so.
Well, I'd like to ask about his conversion story, but before we do that, I've gotten really bad at this, Abby. We have some gifts for you.
Oh my goodness.
Like, how long are we into this interview? I'm giving out the gifts out. So.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Start with that.
I love this bag.
And then Abby, hold on one second. Yeah. Oh no, you go ahead. You go.
Oh my goodness.
Do you like gummy bears?
I do.
Yeah, good.
Oh.
That's one of our RHB mugs.
I love that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so I should be narrating, sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
I can narrate. That's some of our coffee. Yeah.
I love this.
I forget what it says on the front.
Also, this is decaf. Did you know that I drink decaf coffee?
Is that what you drink?
Yeah.
I think that was told.
I pulled it randomly out of the box.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
This is God's providence.
Yep, it is.
So
well, I could have switched it for you if you said you don't drink regular.
So it says dark roast decaf.
Yeah.
And this is what you put in the bag. I'm so. Yeah, I don't drink caffeine, so that's amazing. But I love coffee, so yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough place to be.
I'm a weird person who enjoys.
Understand.
Oh yes.
Yep. You mentioned it. We had to give one to you.
This is beautiful.
We're really excited about that too. So we want it in as many people's hands. There might be another book in there. Oh, I should tell people what it is. That's the new Glorifying and Enjoying God devotions through the Westminster Shorter Catechism.
I was really. I heard the interview that you did with the authors of
with
this
the three
book.
of them.
Yeah, and that was really good. And I was like, and I actually told Samuel about this book, and he was like, "Oh my goodness, we need to get that." So that he wants to. There's a man who I think has special needs in some way, and he's like, "We need something simple," but he wants to be catechized.
Oh wow! Okay.
And so he was like, I said, well, maybe this book would be good because they mentioned it's good, it's accessible even to unbelievers, and so I was like, well, that might be something that he would be interested in doing.
Yeah,
so
that's very encouraging.
Yeah, incredible that the Lord. I mean, like, and that just what the Lord is doing through, like, in the prison.
Yeah,
like that's like, what? Yeah.
Was there another book in there? I put it in the book. Oh, okay. So we have something else for you, which you could probably. Well, do you want to bring it over?
Yeah, we'll bring it over. Might be clear room.
Okay, here.
Oh. Here, I'll scoot it out of the way.
Thank you.
So this is just
Might have to get it
for you to.
Oh my goodness!
You can probably read them yourself first, and then send them off to Samuel and the guys. But we just wanted to send you a bunch of RHB resources. You don't have to like read through all of them, but I think there's something in there kind of like for everyone. So there's the Revival DVD, which you told me that DVDs and hardback have to be donated to the chapel, right? Okay. But the guys can just check them out and read them, right?
Yeah.
So we got a whole bunch of goodies. There's Simonetta Carr's church history. That's awesome. For anyone who's interested in history, I'm sure they'll love it. We have another one of these for Samuel, or like you said, for the guys. Yeah.
All these, and tons of smaller Puritan. Yeah, he's gonna love it.
Here, I'm gonna move this up for you.
Oh yeah, sorry. This is incredible. Wow. And I was curious about Simonetta's. Is that how you say it? Simonetta?
Yeah, Simonetta.
Her car, her books, because you guys had talked about those, and I was like, oh,
yeah,
I've not seen those. I'm curious about it, and so that's really cool that you have a church history book.
And some guys, even adults, are like, well, they're gonna love this. It's full of images from church history, and she's so good in how she describes things in an accessible manner. And
wow, this is
Yeah.
incredible. Thank you so much. This is huge. He's going to be so excited.
Yeah. Well, no, we're excited to get these to him. And especially as we start talking now about like his conversion and all the things that he's been reading and what you guys kind of your vision for the future.
Yeah.
I think all this will have a bit more context to it for the audience.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Abby. Let's take a short break.
Yeah.
Nice hot coffee. My coffee'd gone cold.
Yeah. Mine's a little cold, but I actually enjoy cold coffee more than hot. So yeah, it's actually the perfect temperature for me right now.
It's a decaf cold coffee.
Yeah, I'm kind of all
It's
the
a bit of a weird
anomalies.
combination. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're back from the break. Yeah. You got to meet your lovely family, your mom, aunt, and grandma
Yeah.
down from Charlevoix.
Yeah.
Yeah, Charlevoix.
Yeah, the place where I'm from that is
The place
French.
where you're from, that is French.
Yeah.
And we were talking about, or we're about to talk about Samuel's conversion. So how would he describe it?
Yeah.
And he came to Christ in prison.
In prison, right. So for, I think it was about a year and a half, he was in prison and was resisting kind of the faith. He was reading his Bible every day, though. And he was going to do a Bible study with a guy. And then at one point, the guy that was leading the Bible study said to him, look, like you're denying that you've done anything wrong. You're in prison and you're denying that you've done anything wrong. You need to own up to what you've done and repent.
Wow.
And basically just told him how it was. And at that point he, the Lord saved him. Like he repented and was brought to faith. And I think it was shortly thereafter, he discovered R.C. Sproul in one of his books that I can't remember the name of now. Like The Holiness of God, maybe, or Saved by Grace, maybe. I think actually it was Saved by Grace. And he came to understand the doctrines of grace at that time because he had grown up in the Assemblies of God, had grown up knowing there was a God, believing that, but not having a full understanding of what that meant and what salvation was and what it meant to repent. And so reading R.C. Sproul's Saved by Grace, he came to understand like truly what salvation was. Because he had this kind of overview of it, but didn't understand the depth of it until he understood the doctrines of grace. And he's like, oh, this is what the Christian life is. And and then from that point, he just started to consume all kinds of like Reformed literature that like R.C. Sproul, anything he could get from Ligonier, he would just consume. And then he discovered, he was reading a book by Sinclair Ferguson and wrote a letter to Sinclair Ferguson and sent it to the Dallas campus of RTS to say, hey, can you get this somehow to Sinclair Ferguson? And Peter Yoder's the one who received that letter and said, well, we can't get him the letter. Somehow he couldn't get him the letter, but he's like, but I'd love to correspond with you.
Yeah.
And so they started writing, and he was able to send him books from the RTS library.
I was going to ask that question did the prison already have on hand a number of Reformed works?
Yeah. So Ligonier and the chapel at the prison are connected.
Okay.
In some way. And so Ligonier offers a lot of resources to the prison.
What prison is it?
So it's called Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth. They are an administrative low security facility, but they do have some, because they're a medical center. He's not in the medical portion of it, but there are some people who do need medical care. It's like a hospital, if you can say that. Yeah.
Is it like the VA? Because I go to the VA, and it sometimes feels like a prison.
Yeah, I would say probably a step down from the VA, which is saying something I know. Like, because Samuel is also a veteran. He was also in the Navy for 3 years. So that is, I was like, oh, you guys have some things in common. So that was one. Yeah. But sorry, you said the chapel's connected to Ligonier. Okay. And is the chapel run by prisoners, or is there like a prison chaplain that's their job? Or are there numerous chaplains? So they have 2 chaplains at the chapel at this facility, and they have 1,600 inmates. So that's been tough.
Wow.
Yeah.
So those guys are just
working.
Super busy.
Yeah, working. They do have now one more officer who's helping in the chapel. So they have, I guess, 3 staff members, and then the rest of the chapel is run by inmates. So Samuel works in the chapel. And the Lord has blessed him in that, his ability. Like, it just so happened that when he first came in, someone was like, hey, do you want to work at the chapel? And he said, yes. And that
when he first came into the
prison. Before the Lord had even saved him, he started working in the chapel. And I think through that, he started to see the resources that were available to him.
I see. Are there other... So he was doing that instead of alternate work opportunities?
Yeah, so another opportunity would be working in food service. So we have a couple of friends who do that. So one of the guys prepares breakfast. So he gets up at 4 a.m. and goes into the dining or the chow hall and makes food. Another of our friends works lunches. And so, yeah, that's another job. They also have, like, a lot of the maintenance is done by inmates. So that's an opportunity. There's cleaning jobs where you clean the units. Which is not a job that you want.
Yeah.
It's 300 men in the bathrooms.
Oh boy.
Is a lot. So yeah. And I think he said there's like 5 stalls or 6 stalls and then urinals, but it's just like, wow. Yeah. They have 7 phones that
for 1,600 guys.
For 300. Yeah. So there's they have different units, and on each unit there's 7 phones.
Yeah.
And and the bathrooms, there's only one bathroom for each unit. But,
are there any kind of, like I've seen documentaries on guys making denim or apparel or other type of work that's within the prison or machine work or...
So the facility that he's in is not one where they do like that work, but there are other federal facilities that do that. But because he's a sex offender, he's not eligible to be in those.
Interesting.
Those facilities, because they do actually get paid a lot of times when they're working, and like making things. Like a lot of times they will get paid for that. Like the chairs that they have at the prison where I sit when I go to visit him, they're made by inmates in a different facility.
Okay, so they have like a woodworking shop and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, it's showing me my own ignorance. You've mentioned a few times, like, we have friends, or there's this friend, and I'm like, oh yeah, in prison you have friends.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I just don't ever think about prison, like this whole segment of society, which apparently is quite a large segment of our society.
I never thought about it before I met Samuel. So this
is very eye-opening.
Yeah.
So what kind of work then was he doing in the chapel, or does he do?
So I think he started working in the library. So they have a library and they maintain the library. I think they categorize the books, and if they get new donations, they itemize those and shelve them and whatnot. But he right now works, and he was for a while the orderly. So he was in charge of all the other inmates that worked there. And so he'd do a lot of like the HR stuff, which I don't, because they do get paid a very small amount of money to work. And it's like, I think a monthly allowance that they will get. And it's hardly anything, but there is, I think they do have paperwork that they fill out. There's a whole process, like you have to interview for jobs and applications, which is like, it's like a normal job that you would have on the outside, which is kind of just like, I never knew that, never expected that. And was so surprised when he told me that. But he did that for a while. And then they discovered that the clerk job that he had was taking up too much of his time. And so he needed to focus on that. So he works at the front desk at the prison. I think he prepares pamphlets for people who are in Lubbock unit, which is a unit for medical, like people who have medical issues that are bedridden, I think. So he'll prepare materials for them, resources. Also people who are in they call it the SHU. It's the solitary housing unit. So if they get in trouble, they go to the SHU. And so he'll prepare resources for them. He does how many people have been, like, so he also keeps the numbers. So if there's, like when people come to the chapel for whatever service, they also have to register and say, like, this is the religious organization I'm affiliated with, whether it be Protestant, they have Wiccan, Native American, like they have like Muslim, I think, yeah, all the religions, right? Like, so they register as something, and then they see how many people come to each service, and then I think they administer funding based on those numbers as well.
That's interesting. For
different resources. So, okay. Or allocate funding for that. Yeah. And so he puts the numbers together, or helps the chaplain with getting those numbers in order and double checking them and stuff. Yeah. And yeah.
So these pamphlets you mentioned, what are those? Is it like a newsletter, or is it just like collated resources or excerpts, or what?
So
what are those?
So pamphlets that'll get, I guess it's different depending on who's sending them. Like, so there's the resources. Banner of Truth sends a lot of resources as well, and they have they're just little booklets. Some of the pamphlets are literally just like a leaflet, and like that just has like a short, simple message of like, here's something. He sent me a few of them, and a lot of times they're just like a sheet of paper that's folded in half, has like writing on the whole thing, and then it has like who the resource is from. They have like their address and phone number and stuff like that on it.
Do prisoners send him like requests, like I would like this book, and can then he make contact with the outside world to request that from a certain publisher?
So he cannot make contact with the outside world. Like he'll often ask me, "Hey, can you reach out to this resource?" He's also allowed to. So
wait, sorry. Why are you the conduit? Why can't he just write a letter to Banner of Truth or Sinclair Ferguson?
I think it's easier for me to reach out just because I have an unlimited amount of time to reach out to these people, whereas he has. If you make phone calls, he can't like make the phone call. Oftentimes, people have automated voice. Like when you call something, you have to like hit a button in order to talk to so-and-so or like put in an extension.
Oh,
and he can't call any of those phone numbers because of the way that his phone calls work. Like the system that they use to make phone calls won't allow that to happen. Because you also have to, when he calls, it says, it has a voice recording that says, "You have a prepaid call. You'll not be charged for this call. This call is from," and then it'll say his name. And then it says, "If you'd like to accept this call, hit 5, or if not, or if you don't want to receive calls like this anymore, hit 7. If you want to reject the call, you have to hang up." And so I have to hit a button every time he calls to say I'm accepting the call. But I also have to hear like they're recording this phone call. And also I don't have to pay for it. So that's always good. I'm like, yeah, that's great. I don't have to pay for it. That's lovely. But because he can't call those automated phones, and he can't explain to them necessarily what he's asking for, it's easier for me to make the contact to people. Because I can explain, here's what's going on, here's the situation. And oftentimes when he does ask for resources, people want to send them to him directly. And they can't do that when it's, but he can request them and say, hey, can you send this to the chapel? But don't put my name on it, because if you put my name on it, then it'll get rejected. Because people will see that as sending it to him directly and like favoritism, or it's the federal government and they're against that. I guess I don't fully understand all of it. I don't need to understand it all, but it's what I know. There's rules, and I think people abuse the freedoms that they have, even in prison, and so they are trying to prevent that. I know, yeah. And also there's a lot of contraband that passes through, and so it's a red flag. And then,
yeah, I could imagine.
Like, is he just trying to get contraband in? Like I think is a huge part of it as well. So
he's, you had said that he's done a lot of reading.
Yeah. A lot of reading, yeah.
But it sounds like he's pretty busy though, as well.
Yeah. So he works, it's 20 hours a week in the chapel.
Okay.
4 nights a week he hosts a Bible study in his cell.
4 nights a week.
Yeah. Wow. So he does, and it's 4 nights, and each night they do a different book.
So he's taking them through books of the Bible or other books?
So they usually read other books. So one series that they've been going through for quite some time is Romans by Martin Lloyd-Jones, the sermons. They also, I think they just finished the Sermon on the Mount by Martin Lloyd-Jones. They did Ed Welch's book, When People Are Big and God is Small. They went through that and did the discussion questions. And then they also did Made in America by Michael Horton. I think they went through that book. They've done Instruments in the Redeemer's Hands by Paul Tripp. So when he sees books and he reads books that he thinks are valuable, and he thinks about the men that are in the study and how they would benefit, he gets his hands on them and says, and if there's a guy that's in his study that, doesn't have family really outside. And so he says, well, let's get him the book. So, I'll get him the book, or there's other people in the group that will have their parents get it for him or something. And so they all get the book, and then they read it together, and then they discuss it. And the Lord uses that in mighty ways in order to just really expose their hearts to one another. And then just build a community of like, where are you struggling? What do we do to come alongside you? And so even apart from their studies that they do, they'll sometimes meet and have, I don't know, like interventions, maybe like just coming alongside and saying, hey, look, we noticed that you're struggling with this, and how can we help you? And that happens a lot where there's sin that's happening and they recognize it, but they're like, you're a believer and we know that. So what can we do? Like, how can we support you? How can we love you through this? And that's something that Samuel has always been passionate about, like since the Lord has saved him, and really recognized a need for that, because he himself struggles with that, and just wanting to be vulnerable and to be able to say, look, I need help, and you guys are here. Let's do it. We're part of the body of Christ. How do we promote Christ and bring him glory in that?
I love hearing this because it sounds as though what Samuel and these guys are doing in the prison is exemplary of what I wish more men in the church were doing who were on the outside. Because, and I say that having had lunch with a pastor in town this past week who said, I said, what's been the hardest thing for you in your minutes? He's been here for let's say, I think it's about half a decade now,
Okay.
at a Reformed church in town. And I said, what's been the hardest thing for you that you feel like seminary didn't prepare you for?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, men's ministry. I said,
Yeah.
well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, the guys aren't vulnerable with each other. They don't know how to be.
Yeah.
They just don't know how to engage in relationship, or they're unwilling to.
Mm-hmm.
And they just don't, like, we just feel like you're trying to maintain this ideal of like the American self-made man.
Mm-hmm.
And yet at the same time be a Christian man who's open with his struggles and feelings and doubts and insecurities and all these things. And it's like, how do you reconcile those two together?
Mm-hmm.
The way that you're presenting it, what's happening in the prison, it's kind of like, oh, wow, they're doing a better job than we are.
Actually, they are. And it's, so there are men.
It's so convicting.
It is. It is quite, it's incredible. There are men who have been released over the last few years from prison, from Samuel's ministry, who have gotten out and said, we can't find what we had in prison. What out here? Like, what do we do? How do we?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it must be so hard for these guys when they come out.
Yeah.
And they're with like convicted felons.
Yeah. They have nothing.
And then they come out to like guys who are not convicted felons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Like,
yeah.
There's it must feel like there's this wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's been really hard to watch. Because some of them I have contact with, some of the guys who have been out. And some of them are doing well. And some of them have had some really difficult life circumstances as a result of the church not accepting them, or not knowing how to handle the situation, the circumstances. And they don't have anyone on the outside that is willing to step up and advocate for them either.
Yeah. So they kind of get it from two sides, because on the one hand, the perception of the church is like, we're going to be really cautious around you because of your background, as if, you're a criminal or were whatever. But on the other side, it's coming at them from like, it's like two walls.
Mm-hmm.
There's who you were and where you came from, and we on the outside, we're not vulnerable with each other like that.
Yeah.
It must be so hard. Like, I thought it was hard transitioning out of the military, which it is.
Yeah.
This sounds way harder.
Yeah. And Samuel could probably speak to that. Well, actually not yet, maybe, but.
Because at least as a military vet, you're viewed as someone who's honorable, someone who has stepped up to do their duty for the country. There's whether or not any of that's true, but at least there's that perception.
Yeah, yeah.
That must be so, so hard for these guys. I can't even imagine what they're going through.
Yeah.
Like, I have to confess, I don't even know at the church that we've been going to, like, any former inmates.
Yeah.
And there may be some there. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I think in some ways that's a good thing, right? Because it's not necessarily everyone's business. But at the same time, there is a certain level of protection.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
And that's something that Samuel and I have often talked about, is like, we see it being helpful to share, like, yes, he was in prison. Yes, he is a sex offender. Like, we're not going to hide that from people. But I think the leadership is certainly needs to know what's going on, and should come alongside and say, we're here to protect you, but also to protect those others who are in the church. But also, like, they don't need to know the whole, like, the whole congregation doesn't need to know the whole story. But there is some protection in sharing, some of the details of their lives that are like, yeah, he was a convicted felon, or he is a convicted felon. But the leadership definitely needs to know what's going on.
When you say what's going on, can you elaborate?
What sin struggles are there? So some people it's drugs, right? Like, some people are in prison for drugs. Leadership should know that. And if that's a vice that they have, and despite the fact that they've been in prison for, 2 or 4, 5, 8 years, whatever, it's still something that's in their hearts. And the Lord does work in great ways and can free people from that, but that's not always the case. And so if that's a struggle that a person is having, leadership needs to know that.
Yeah. I think yes, I fully agree with you on that.
Yeah.
I think, so if you're listening to this and you're in ministry, pay attention, because this is really, really important. It's that, and this is something that has just come to my mind now that we've been talking about. Sure, these guys are going to have, like we've been talking about through this discussion, like we're still in this body of sin, and there's lingering sin or struggles that we have that we will spend the rest of our lives engaging with.
Yeah.
Like a Pilgrim's Progress type
Absolutely, yeah.
battle. Like the battle doesn't end until you reach the celestial city. So, however, let's set that kind of sin issue thing to the side. It's there and it's real.
Yeah.
But it's there for everyone else in the congregation too.
Absolutely.
And what's unique to these guys coming out of prison, especially those who, like Samuel and others, have been in a context where, in a way, they've been forced to be vulnerable with each other to an extent that us guys on the outside we're not forced into that corner to be that vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm saying is,
yes.
if you're like in ministry listening to this, like there's guys in your congregation, maybe women too, who have gotten accustomed and been blessed by a certain level of vulnerability, but also, it sounds strange to say this, but a camaraderie based on the fact that, hey, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
Like that wall of like inmate, non-inmate isn't there.
Yeah. Yeah, there is definitely, and that's the other part too, is the perception of and what kinds of walls. Yeah. I think there's also, there's a pastor that Samuel communicates with regularly, who's eventually, we hope to be our pastor when he gets out. But he mentioned to me this unique situation about prison and just the idea that it does force you to be vulnerable, because people are seeing the worst thing you've ever done in your life is just laid out bare for other people to see. And so every guy that's in there is in the same situation. And I think that's part of my...
The rest of us are all still hiding our sin.
And I think that's part of like God's grace in my life. The worst thing I ever did, has been laid bare for people to see. And so, and through Samuel, I've learned even more what vulnerability is, just because that's something he's so good at cultivating in others. Like, of course, it's going to seep into our relationship. But there was a pastor that he was communicating with for a while who was like, I'd love for you to get in communication with my elders and be able to teach us, like, what are you doing in your ministry that these guys are willing to share with you? Like, what can we do differently in our ministry in order to cultivate what it is that you have in prison? And Samuel was like, this is so humbling. Like, I'm not doing anything special. Like, I'm just doing what I've read the church should be doing.
Oh, wow.
And just the influence of the Puritans in his life and just what the Puritans did. He's trying to model that, and he doesn't do it perfectly. But that's his desire, is to really follow the heart of, like, to see the heart of man and to expose the sin. Samuel's also very direct. Like, he's not afraid to, well, I shouldn't say he's not afraid. He is sometimes afraid to say things because people can be intimidating. But he recognizes that God calls us to speak the truth in love.
Yeah. Let's talk about that aspect of the Puritans as an influence.
Yeah.
Because it's an interesting point that you just brought up about them being a model of sorts for him.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes a lot of us think of Puritan writings as good instruction in biblical doctrine, like a good way to think more deeply about these great truths of Scripture. Whereas it sounds like what Sammy is doing is that, but also in terms of ministering to others. So having these numerous Bible studies throughout the week, and actually coming alongside other men. So yeah, just as a general question, how has his reading in the Puritans specifically, so not Sproul, MacArthur, Piper, that's all, of course, beneficial in its own right, but the Puritans specifically, and you've mentioned in your email to me, I mean, I'm put to shame. He's read more than I have.
That's not, I mean, that doesn't even scratch the surface, if I'm being honest.
Sure.
I mean, like, there's so much more.
You said, I'm just reading from your email from last week. He recently went through Jeremiah Burroughs' The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment. Of course, it's a classic.
Yeah.
Everyone should read that.
The Loveliness of Christ.
Yep. He's going through Calvin's not a Puritan, but going through Calvin's Institutes. I mean, it's really incredible, you know?
So I figured out the book that I said William Perkins. I was wrong. Now I can't remember who the author is, but On Domestical Duties is the book that he's currently going through.
Okay.
And that book specifically is about home life, I think, and just what, as Christians, our life should be at home and how we should be living. And this idea that we are to be living at home as we're living like outside of the home, like inside the home and outside the home are supposed to be similar. But then also just this idea, I think he's the one who kind of talks about parents, how you parent your children, and offering just like biblical guidance in that way, of like how to parent children, how to like treat your spouse, and those things. I believe those are, he shares with me some of the things that he's reading, and it's just, it's incredible to see what these Puritans believed, like how they carried themselves and what their lives were like. And then being able to, he desires to implement those things because he's like, the Puritans, yeah, they had a lot of flaws, but they did a lot of things right. And so we should desire that as well. And revival, I think, came as a result of that. Like Puritans and the preaching that was, Jonathan Edwards is another one that he's read a lot of. And just seeing his ministry, which Edwards was.
I consider him a Puritan. Other people don't.
Yeah, I was like, I think he was. Yeah, he was a little after, but yeah,
he was a little bit after. But I mean, come on, that wasn't his fault.
Yeah, the Lord used him,
and he was over in the U.S., not you know, in English.
But his favorite Puritan, I think, is Samuel Rutherford. So I'd love to tell you about the story of Samuel Rutherford and Samuel's life. So when I first met Samuel, he writes at the top of every single one of his letters, FMC, Fort Worth, God's Palace. And so I asked him, I said, why do you do that? So Samuel Rutherford was in prison in Scotland.
I believe that's right.
And while he was in prison for preaching the gospel and preaching. He was Presbyterian during, during a time when that was not acceptable in the UK. So, but he was imprisoned, and so during that time of imprisonment, he would write at the top of his letters, Aberdeen, which was the name of the prison that he was in, and then he would write God's Palace, and that was a reminder to him that God's palace, like wherever he is, like is where God has him, and thus it's a palace for him in which to dwell. He also said one of his favorite quotes is that the king keeps his best wine in the cellar, which he's like, he can relate. So Samuel Rutherford is this man that he can totally relate to his circumstances and situations. Yeah. Obviously it's a different, like Samuel actually is in prison for a crime that he committed. Right. And Samuel Rutherford was in prison for preaching the gospel. So that may not be a parallel, but there are other aspects of his life that are very much a parallel. Much of his ministry was done through letter writing, and Samuel has a very prolific letter writing ministry that he corresponds with. I always joke that he has more friends than I do because he corresponds with so many people. It's incredible. I'm just, But he read The Loveliness of Christ by Samuel Rutherford as one of his favorite books. That was something that he talked about when we first started corresponding, was just like the loveliness of Christ and that Christ is his treasure, and wanting to show that to other people and demonstrate to other people, like, Christ is my treasure. And the Puritans can point us to that, and can reveal that to us in a way that I don't know is always expressed in modern thought, or I guess, I don't know.
Yeah. How was he first introduced to the Puritans? Has he told you? Yes,
actually, that was something I had to ask him, because I was like, I don't remember how that happened. Because we talk a lot about a lot of things, but for him it was Spiritual Maturity, I think, is a book by J. Oswald Sanders. Or maybe it's just Oswald Sanders.
I'll have Abby look it up.
Yeah. So okay. I know the last name is Sanders. He wrote a book.
It's J. Oswald Sanders.
Okay. Yeah. So he wrote that book, and in the book he goes over a lot of biographical information about different influential believers. And one of them that he mentioned was Samuel Rutherford. Mm-hmm. So Samuel Rutherford was one of the first Puritans that Samuel discovered. He had a whole, I guess there was a whole address to some kind of ministry that had this book that he wanted. And so he wrote to this address and asked for Puritan resources from them. And they sent him just a bunch of books, and he just read all of them.
Wow. It wasn't RHB?
No.
Oh, what a shame.
He, but
should have been us.
Funny story too about that. So when we first started corresponding, he reached out to Banner of Truth, because Banner of Truth has sent him a lot of resources over the years. He writes to them pretty regularly and says, hey, can I get this resource? And they're usually pretty good at sending it. But when we started corresponding, he was like, I'm going to ask Banner of Truth to send you some resources. And so he asked for a bunch of, or actually I think he had bought some things. Like I think he had put in an order. And somehow the order got messed up. He was like, I don't know why they haven't sent it to you. I don't know what's going on. So he said, can you call Banner of Truth and talk to someone there and figure out what happened to this order that I have? And so I was like, this is like a month after we started talking. I'm like, and I have naturally not a very, I'm super shy typically. And I'm not one to reach out to people, which it shows you how much I've grown in the last 3 years for me to reach out to you and say, hey, can I have your podcast? But I called Banner of Truth and talked to a lady and was kind of explaining to her the situation. Like, hey, my fiance, or at the time, I think I called him my boyfriend or something. I'm like, my boyfriend was trying to order me some resources, but he didn't get them. And I was really nervous to say he's in prison, was not super forthcoming about it. It was a new thing. And I was kind of nervous about how people responded at that time. And so eventually it came out. I was like, oh, he's in prison. She's like, well, what's his name? And I was like, Samuel Condo. She says, oh, I know Samuel. And I was like, what? How do you know him? She's like, well, I know the name. He writes to us all the time. And so she knew exactly who I was talking about. She knew exactly what was going on. And she's like, yeah, let me just get you. So then she immediately, her demeanor changed when she found out who it was that we were talking about. And she was immediately like, yes, we're going to get you these resources. All this stuff is going to come to you. But it was just so funny how quickly it changed because of Samuel. And so that to me was I've only known this guy for a month, but I was like, all right, yeah. It's not just me. I'm not the only one who sees this guy as, yeah.
It sounds like he really makes a strong impression on people.
Yeah.
So whether it was Heather writing to him for 3 years, knowing you just a month, but all these other people, Paul or Peter down in Texas.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
He does have a very, just a way about him. The Lord is moving in his life and it's evident. And I think people immediately recognize that and are drawn to it.
Yeah.
It's not so true in prison with a lot of the people that he talks to, just because they're not as, but he has a small group of men that are drawn to him because of that, because they see that he's willing to tell them the truth.
He's willing to tell them the truth.
Yeah.
That's so important.
Yeah.
I would assume then that in prison there is still a lot of, well, human beings, right?
Yes.
So not telling the truth, a lot of, puffing the chest out,
Oh, yeah.
this kind of like facade of masculinity. It's just, again, it's so amazing to me that there's these guys who are meeting together, being very vulnerable with each other, who are in the place where, prison is often, especially federal prison, is considered the place where, like, you got to be an ultra man to survive that.
Yeah.
Ultra, like, the ultra in sense of like bad, tough masculinity.
Yeah, the toxic.
And you're telling me it's something that's actually totally the opposite. These guys who are very honest with each other.
Yeah. The vulnerability that is the opposite of what people that wrong view of masculinity, that is, I would say, the opposite of the biblical masculinity, right? Like but then you have these men who are pursuing biblical masculinity there.
Wow.
And actually Samuel's been quite fortunate. So there is a hierarchy in the prison, and he's at the bottom of the totem pole. Because
even though he's been there for a while.
Yeah, so his offense puts him at the bottom. So
so that's how they base it.
Yeah, that your hierarchy is based on what you've done.
Really? So not time in or
nothing to do with time in. It's all about
size of your
offense.
biceps.
Yeah, and it's your offense and the people that you spend your time with. And if you are a sex offender, no one wants to talk to you. And there are certain areas you can't go in the prison. Here we go.
There we go.
So this is Samuel.
Hey, Samuel, this is Tavis Bohlinger. Nice to meet you, brother.
Yeah.
I think you can ask him a question.
Oh.
We're here.
Hey, so we're here just recording an episode of the Modern Puritan, and we've been having a really great conversation with Veronica. And I just want to, first of all, just thank you for doing this and using up some of your phone minutes for the month to join us. Really curious to hear just how you're doing.
Well, spite of the things this morning, doing well. A little concerned because I was wondering how long it was going to take, and they finally just very excited. And I just sorry for taking so long, and also it just seemed.
No, you're fine. We've been having a great just conversation with Veronica, and just finding out some of your story. And man, I would love to just hear. I think we'll just jump right into it, and I'd love to hear about your time doing or leading these Bible studies. Veronica said 4 nights a week. Like, what's it been like for you, and I guess also for the guys who are in these Bible studies, and if you can just break it down, like what it looks like to do a Bible study in a prison.
Well, the Bible study, just think of, you could imagine if you were in a kitchen with, well, not a bunch, maybe like 4 or 5 guys, and then very, very tight, just very, very close, if you will. We do something now. We are reading Martin Lloyd-Jones' series.
You're cutting out a bit.
Sorry. We're reading through Romans for Martin Lloyd-Jones. We're in chapter 9. We started in chapter 1.
Okay.
That's been a long time going. So we're doing a book study on Thomas Watson's A Body of Divinity, and reading and discussing, taking time out to about not only what he's saying, like the words and understanding those words, but also the implications of those things. And then also just the practicalities or the practical side of that looks for our lives as we're in prison.
Yeah. Watson's Body of Divinity was a huge, huge comfort to me when I was going through postgraduate studies in Durham in England. And just, academic study can be so kind of cold sometimes and not very devotional, but that the Body of Divinity, the way that Watson describes things in the picturesque language and the prose is quite beautiful. I can imagine that's quite a comfort to you guys there in the prison, yeah?
That I would definitely agree. And it is a comfort. At the same time, it can be very challenging how your life is, how we're treated to glorify God. Sometimes we read that word glorify, or even just for it. But just what that means to live a life that glorifies God. Where day in and day out, moment to moment.
And
Yeah. What, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just gonna, the other question I'm really curious to hear from you is, if you could just describe kind of, is there anything like that you guys, and especially the guys that you're ministering to, is there anything in particular that?
Yeah, you can keep talking now.
Oh, okay.
She just comes in and reminds us that we're
she
talking to
reminds us.
someone in prison. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really great. Sometimes I forget, and so then
The bureaucracy is lovely.
Yeah.
So what is it? Would you say there's something that is common in terms of what the guys in prison in particular are struggling with? And then the follow-on to that question is, what is it that you have found, and I guess all you guys have found in the Puritans, or any of the books you're reading that have helped to address some of that?
One of the biggest issue, the thing that most men struggle with. We do things because we're afraid of what man think or say or do or may not think, or we sort of make choices too good to those who are around us. And honest, that fear of man is what drives most people. And it shows the lack of the fear of God. I think about that, and then I think about the Puritans and the way that they only helped me. Is they teach us to be.
They teach us to be what?
Transparent.
Yeah.
And it's that they like willing to be laid open before God, and those not to be on display in the sense of, hey, look at me, but more of the sense that, hey, this is me. I need a physician. I think something else that happens is kind of playing into it. There's this teaching that's out there that, and I say from the pulpit, and it comes along something to the effect of, well, God just wants you to be happy, and He wants you to be a better person. and he wants you to do good things, and he's going to comfort you. And you're afraid, it's okay. He'll give you strength, and those things are true, but they don't address the root of the matter. They don't address the fact that I'm a holy God, and I need just to be a better person. I need a person. I need to be happy. I need light in Christ. I need to light myself in the Lord. Chapter 1, verse 2, where he says that the righteous man is the one who meditates on the law. The law of the Lord is his delight, and he meditates on it day and night. And I think there's something to be said about that. Something that's really restored, if you will, taught from the pulpit. And so I find that the Puritans help to bring that out. The soul is really much more important than we're giving it credit.
What's more important?
The soul.
The soul. Yeah.
What an interesting answer. I thought you were going to speak about a specific type of sin that guys struggle with, which I guess the fear of man is, but you talked about that as the source of these other sins that guys may be doing is, fear of man, fear of losing face. That's a profound answer. Yeah, even in prison, we struggle with that on the outside. Thanks for that, Sam. In some of the email conversations that Veronica and I have been having leading up to this podcast, she had mentioned your desire to enter the ministry once you're out. Can you elaborate on that and maybe talk about some of the things you've been doing in preparation?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I was just thinking about in leading and really being more intentional in the sense of just coming alongside of them, meeting them where they are, encouraging them to be more open, more transparent, acknowledge their shortcomings. That is not so much like, hey, look at me, but in a sense that it's this is part of me, and I need to show, of a verse, but basically applying the balm. I don't remember what it is. Apologize, my name. But basically, we're just saying we're applying Christ to that point. Mm-hmm. And I think about how that is. At times, a lot of people are struggling, especially some of the guys here that are around, and taking time, then applying that He is Christ, us them to think of it is that's struggling with, but how to understand the.
This call is from a federal prison.
A lot of times we think of the gospel as like, Christ died on the cross for our sins. Okay, so now that's that, but then where do we go? And it's like, well, the gospel is that also. I think about that. It's sort of the answer to the question of what I'm doing here. And my desire is, there's a sense of call to shepherding, that's people, but there's also, I don't know, just the sense of missionary work as well. I don't know really, but then there's also another thought that I have, or say some counselor and.
You said a biblical counselor?
Biblical counselors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and be on the side of those. I can't help but think of. I was thinking about Richard Baxter, and I was off, who just has this heart of wanting to encourage his people, and that comes out a lot for me. I see people struggle a lot with like things that are just so obvious, and want to.
When you say people struggle with things that are so obvious, you mean they're obvious to you, but not necessarily to them, right?
Yes, that's what I mean. Thank you.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm 15 seconds, so we're gonna get cut off.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah. We'll talk
It's
to
been
you
really
again.
good to talk to you, man.
Yeah.
I will call back in 15.
All
Okay.
right.
He called in.
He made it. It sounds like they had something going on this morning. So
Yeah.
that's typical, the life of being an inmate.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's fine. Maybe you know the answer to this question, but what is the Reformed presence in prison, or at least in his prison?
Yeah. So there are 4 guys on his unit, so including him. That will come to his study. I think there may be 1 or 2 more who don't come to his study just because of personality differences and whatnot. But they also do have, so there's several different units on the compound. And so they also, in addition to the 4 Bible studies that they have on his unit every night, they do or every week, they have on Tuesday afternoons, they meet for everyone in the compound. Like all the Reformed guys on the compound will come to this Bible study that they have on Tuesday afternoons. And they do kind of a similar thing where they go through, Be Thou My Vision by Jonathan Gibson, that liturgy. They usually try to use that and go through that together. And then they have a time of sharing and just expressing to one another, like, here's where I'm struggling. Here's what the Lord is doing. And so I think there's probably 10 or 15 guys. It's not a very large group. Maybe it might be 20, but it's.
I mean, that sounds like a pretty good group of guys.
Yeah,
to be honest.
For being
to get 20 guys together.
I could be exaggerating.
Every Tuesday.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, they get together in the chapel and meet. But I know it's a lot, and there's different guys that come just to see what they're about, and a lot of them he actually works with in the chapel as well that are on different units from him. And those guys, they have their own Bible studies on their own units.
Okay.
And so, but not all of them are as intentional as Samuel's. So Samuel is, I think Samuel is the leader of that group just because the Lord has gifted him in that way. And so his studies are a lot more structured, I think, than a lot of the other ones. And his ability to cultivate that is a little bit stronger just because that's how the Lord has gifted him. And I don't know that all of the guys have been gifted in that way. Yeah. But they do, I mean, like they do still have, like they take the influence that Samuel has on them and try to kind of establish those things in their Bible studies as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now the guys don't have a choice of who they room with. Is that correct?
They do.
Oh.
And so, it's kind of, in some ways. So
you could potentially be with another believer if you wanted to.
Yeah, so Samuel's cellmate is a guy who he had been in their study for probably a year and a half. And then when Samuel's cellmate left, then he had an open space. And so his current cellmate came in and is a believer and has been in the study. And I talk to his cellmate actually pretty regularly now. For a while, we weren't really, of course, talking too much, but he'll call me like once a week now. Sometimes more than that if there's something going on. And we talk and just like he's read a lot from the Puritans and from Reformed theology and has a good grasp of things encourages me when I need it, and I'm able to encourage him. And sometimes he's, if there's a scuffle, there's two guys living in a tiny cell, there can be like sin is exposed in that way. And so sometimes it's kind of, I can be someone who's like, I get both sides, I see it all. So it's kind of a really unique and like blessing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many years does Samuel have left?
His release date, the official release date, I guess, for him on the BOP website would be March 28th of 2028. Typically in the federal system, with such a long sentence, his time in a halfway house is a little bit longer. So we anticipate, Lord willing, that he'll get out in June of 2027. He could participate in a program that would put him out in June of 2026, but we're still debating whether or not he wants to do that, because there are some stipulations that would come with that may kind of make life more difficult for us, but also it would get him out a year early, so that would be great. But we're just kind of trying to work through that, pray about it, and see what the Lord has for us in that way. So, yeah.
And as we asked him right there, you all have the goal to go into ministry. Is that him again?
Sorry, no, that's my mom.
Okay. She's like, why aren't you done yet?
Sorry.
We can wrap things up.
Oh, no,
here.
I think, he's going to call us back too. So I think,
okay.
But I think she's just kind of wondering, we might go, I don't know what we're doing with, so I don't know. We'll see.
So the goal when you get out is some type of ministry.
Yeah. So he'll have to go to school first. But we are currently in the process of, like, I've kind of started to help him do some correspondence courses so he can get his bachelor's degree done, so he can go to seminary. But he wants to go to seminary for either biblical counseling or, just pastoral ministry, I think. And he probably will do both, actually. And we are the pastor that we're talking to and desire to be part of his church, and Lord willing will be, as the congregation has already kind of made it clear, like, we would love to have you. The only thing that's standing in our way is I have to communicate with the probation office the church is in North Carolina, so I have to communicate with the probation office in North Carolina and ask for their permission, will you accept Samuel to do probation there? And if they say yes, then we will move to North Carolina. And this pastor is pastor of an OPC church out there. And he's kind of just been talking to Samuel twice a week for the last probably 2 or 3 months. Actually, maybe even longer than that. I think it was July when we reached out to him. So, yeah. So they've been talking since July, and he's actually just recently told us that he wants to come out and visit us.
Wow.
And meet Samuel, which is huge.
Yeah.
And totally beyond our expectations. Like, the Lord has just been so faithful in blessing us in that way. And so the OPC church is kind of where we're hoping to end up. Just because that's kind of aligns most closely to what we're looking at. So,
are there opportunities for guys in prison to do some of their seminary work there?
So actually, when Peter was his friend Peter was a director of admissions at RTS Dallas, and kind of helped us kind of understand a little more of what seminary entails. Samuel does have to get his bachelor's degree before he can go to seminary, and so because he doesn't have his bachelor's done, he's not able to do anything for seminary yet. So that's kind of our first goal, is to get him. And there are schools that will do correspondence courses. Samuel does not have access to the internet at all, particularly because of his charge, and the crime that he committed was communication over the internet. That limits his access to internet. But also, no inmates, I think, have like free reign of the internet, really, or even, I think, limited access. I don't think any of them have that in the facility that he's in.
Yeah.
So everything has to take place through the mail. So there's probably like 3 schools in the country that will do male classes. And so that's kind of where we're starting right now. But I don't know what would happen. I mean, given the amount of information that he's kind of taken, I don't know what that's going to look like, what seminary will look like for him, and what people are going to do.
He's done enough reading. He should probably just they should probably just give it to him.
That's why I'm like, well, yeah. Sometimes I wonder.
Get some Greek and Hebrew in there, and
yeah, and actually his dad. He saw his dad for the first time in 4 years just last weekend.
Okay.
And when his dad was down there talking to him, he said, "We're going to get you some Greek, like homeschool materials, and we're going to send those to you." You know, just trying to figure out the logistics of how we could get those to him.
Yeah.
So he does. I mean, like, because he does desire to learn Greek, obviously, and that's part of seminary. So, but he's going to start while he's in prison. So, and Samuel was homeschooled.
Okay.
So he's able to. I think that has really helped him as he's been in prison. His ability to kind of teach himself,
self-study.
Yeah. Yep.
Self-driven.
Mm-hmm. And just knowing how to set goals and how to achieve those goals. Which I'm like, yeah. The Lord has blessed him and really has prepared him for being in prison in a lot of ways. So it's cool.
Yeah.
But
what's been the hardest part of having a relationship with him over these past number of years?
The living alone, knowing that there is someone that I love and desire to be with. I think, living alone. And something that the Lord has been comforting me with lately is, so we're in the process of getting married currently. So there's, in the federal system, you have to prove that you're not married to anyone else in any other states that you've lived in. And then like get permission from the warden to get a marriage license. And so I have finally gotten all the paperwork because we both have lived in California, Texas, and I lived in Michigan for a while. And so I had to get all the paperwork from all those different states and send them in to the prison. And so, so we're waiting to get married. But once we get married, there will still be a period of time where we will be married. But we will nothing will change about our relationship in pretty much any sense, apart from there's a piece of paper that says that we're married. Because that physical relationship will not occur until he gets out. And so part of the comfort that I find is that our relationship is a picture of the gospel in this sense that we're married or will be married, but that final consummation has not happened. And that is the Christian life. The gospel has been presented to us. We've been saved. We have this seal of the Holy Spirit, but there's still a glorification that's yet to occur. And we look forward to that. And so that's our relationship is we have this piece of paper that says we're married, but we haven't yet had that final, like, like the consummation of marriage, right? Like, and that's a really sweet comfort to know I get to experience firsthand, like, this reality that we all talk about, this reality that is, like, the gospel in general. But that's, like, my life. And I'm so comforted to know and so blessed to know that that is what I get to experience. And that longing and that desire that I have to be with Samuel in person and in a physical way is a longing that I have for heaven as well. And so that's really, like, just a sweet thing. So it is hard, though. I won't deny the difficulty of that. But the great comfort that's found in that as well is really sweet.
Yeah. It just touches again on this whole aspect of hope.
Yeah.
Hope in the midst of like longing, loss, and like there's nothing that we can do. It's going back to even the suicide discussion of like, there's nothing I can do to bring the Lord back quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Like even suicide doesn't bring him back quicker.
Yeah.
That's on his time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We can pray thy will be done, but
Yeah.
only.
And Maranatha all you want.
Yeah.
Which you should be praying that every day.
Yeah.
But
more often than we do. Like I certainly am guilty of not praying for that enough, but yeah.
yeah. And so the world that we inhabit every day, we're consumed with just the simple things of life that seem so overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
In my own instance, like providing for my kids and my wife and
Mm-hmm.
making sure everyone gets enough time and job and on and on and on. It just really makes you lose focus of the stuff the thing that really matters.
Yeah.
Which is anticipating, preparing for his return.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it sounds like you and Samuel are living that in a way that most of us don't.
Yeah.
And excuse me, it sounds really, really hard. But also, and again, going back to the suicide discussion, is the Lord is giving you that, it seems, as a way that it would seem like, it's him again, like biblical counseling would be a natural, or pastoral ministry would be natural.
Yeah, absolutely. And
hey, Samuel, do you hear us? Yeah, we're just, give us 1 second. Are we good?
yep, we're good. Sorry.
I'm glad that you two learned how to use this app.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, we're going to go. But hold on a minute, Samuel. Oh, he's on hold.
Are you
All right, we're good now? Okay. Hey, Samuel, you back with us?
Yeah.
Okay. Veronica was telling us about the church in North Carolina, the OPC church.
Yep.
And I think when we left off, you were talking about either pastoral ministry, biblical counseling, maybe a combination of the two. And I guess if you could just tell us, like, what are you guys, or what are you reading now, and what's just been happening with you recently in terms of the things you've been encountering in your readings, in particular in the Puritans, and how that's being brought to bear in your life there in prison.
Wow, that's a big question. What am I reading? Well, so I'm reading William Gouge or Gouge, of Domestical Duties, which is really good. It's helpful in many ways to my role as like his future husband, but also in the sense as a future father, Lord willing, and also just as a man of God in general, settings. So it's the other one is The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment by Jeremiah Burroughs. That's a hard book to read. Not so much because it's deep. I mean, not so much because of the fact that or anything of that nature. It's just hard because the things that he says is how to pierce the soul in such a way that it causes you to think about, wow, I'm so far away from contentment.
Mm.
Lord me in that. That's something I see that God is working in my life.
You said, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but we heard you say that contentment, the last thing we heard you say was something about contentment, and that's where you are. Can you maybe say where, repeat a little bit of what you said, just so we can kind of more.
Saying that that book and Jeremiah Burroughs is expressing, that's seen life, looking through that, is
This call is from a federal prison.
on the outside a lot of times look a certain way, but on the inside all that's falling apart. And I think that one of the things about being a Christian, and this from like the Puritans and others, but the inside should be together with the outside, if I could put it that way. The body and soul together is one. It's that's the aspect of being, because both of them are together, not calm on the outside and scared on the inside. I'm on the inside, therefore I'm calm on the outside. That has a lot of happening from what contentment is. Calming and learning to be calm in the sense no matter what takes place on the inside. That's working through a lot.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the other book that I'm reading right now is Joseph Aileen, is A Sure Pathway to Heaven, which is another Puritan. Well, he's not an easy Puritan to read either. Definitely causes one to rethink their conversion and to rethink if they have been converted to Christ. Always reaching for whatever you think may be saved. He'll reach for that and pull that away from you and say, no, can't be that. Well, that, it's not. You're not. Well, that, it's not. Only Christ alone. And he is a good way that is heavy and so much so that in his book he actually will say every couple of pages, I'll stop. So I think those things are, or as they may be, they're helpful because as I read my Bible that I'm in, it's easy to become a Pharisee. It's easy to become religious. And God using these men to keep me from that. I think one of the biggest aspects of that is what I am trying to do with the men that are around me, so that I too can help them the way that God is using Christians and His Word. Just another religious, righteous person, really being, as said, we're yet justified. Recognizing that.
You said sinner yet justified, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was long-winded, but I think that.
Beautiful.
No, that's a good answer. You can be as long-winded as you want because we've done enough talking already on this podcast.
Yeah.
How would you say that the books that you have there, especially the Reformed literature, changes the men that you're ministering to?
Right. So your question was, how is the literature that I have changing the men?
Right. So there's these men that you are ministering to in the Bible studies that you've got the chapel library that has various resources. How have you seen individual prisoners' lives being changed through the things they're reading?
So I was thinking about the way that looks. And honestly, I could just say that when I think about Reformed theology or biblical theology, you can't help but recognize that the underlining theme that's in biblical theology is that God is sovereign. Like, God is much bigger and more involved than other views of or denominations or theologies of Christianity, to admit. And I think that the more that people are exposed to this basic premise is that God is sovereign, doesn't limit himself, as some may say, and he doesn't look past certain things. He doesn't, want only the best for you, in a sense that nothing bad ever happens to you, and that if there's ever bad things that happen to you, that that's not God. That's because of you, or that's because of Satan. And that whole aspect is turned upside down in theology, because as well, the Lord gives and the Lord takes, as Job says. And as Job says, that are we to thank God for the good and not for
This call is from a federal prison.
For the evil, in Job chapter 2. So I see that usually is the starting point of change for the guys when they're introduced to this. And once that hard pill is swallowed and taken in and thought through and worked out, believed and accepted by faith, then there's changes in the other aspects of how that is applied to our lives and how should I live before this holy God. And I would say that basically is the more that we teach them about God and who that is, what his attributes are, more willingness to be exposed, but also for not only God, but also fellow man, allowing God to work through them. Right? Very simplistic way of putting it, but I think it hones in on most important aspects of theology, and
So let me ask you maybe a difficult question here, but what when you are finally out, what do you think you're going to miss the most about being in prison? And in particular, I'm thinking of the Bible studies you're leading, the men that you're with. I know it's a strange question. We often think, oh, of course, if you're in prison, you want to be out. But what will you miss about the time that you're spending there now?
No, it's actually a really good question. And I think the thing that I'm going to miss the most is the food. I'm just kidding. No, but
that's a great answer.
But in all honesty, I think the thing that I'll miss the most is being able to have the opportunities to be in. I hear a lot after the guys leave and they go home, and there is nothing out here like we had in there.
Yeah.
How that what makes it different than what's out there. And one of the things is it's like just that sense of we're going to be intentional with each other. We need to know what's happening with you, going on with you, not life, but what's going on with your heart.
Yeah.
Happening there. And a lot of times we don't go there because it takes too much time. Life is happening. And also it can get messy. And out there you can just run away and just hide into your house and not have to worry about the messy.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to do that. Run from the messiness. And to see that person. So I think that's something I'm going to miss, that intentionality.
I think his call is ending. Are you still there with us, Samuel?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
I'll back in like 20 seconds.
You got 20 seconds?
Yeah.
In that case,
3 seconds.
Thanks for joining us. We need to get you in here live.
Oh, yeah. He's gone.
He's gone. They're going to go to the next card. I set them up that way. Yeah, but we'll wrap this up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I realized it's past lunchtime. Here we are. But
No, it's good. This is good. I would stay another few hours if I could.
Yeah.
I'm sure Abby's got stuff to get to. And yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
I asked him that last question about what he'd miss because of what you had told me earlier about the guys enjoying like this vulnerability that we don't have out here.
Yeah.
So I know that it's not anywhere close being in the military, but getting out of the Navy was really hard for me. And I know it is for a lot of guys because we lose in like an instant. Like you walk out the gate and all that camaraderie's gone.
Yeah.
And that unified mission. And yeah, and if you're a Christian in the military too, there's like there can be a vulnerability. It's just, I can't imagine it being as strong as it is for Samuel and those guys. Yeah.
And I think, I think he probably could tell you that he knows a little bit about that, having left the Navy as well. But I think his was a little bit different. I know that he had some struggles when he got out of the military, but I think a lot of that was, there were a lot of factors going into that. But but I do think that he probably recognizes that as well and can kind of relate those things.
Yeah.
But I thought it was helpful when he said just the community aspect of that. He said it in such a way that I didn't expect him to phrase it, which he always does. So, yeah.
Yeah. Just things that, again, like I've never thought about these things. We often get presented this picture of prison through movies or even books, but especially in the movies, it's like the one word that comes to mind would be isolated.
Yeah.
You're in your cell and you get let out for exercise and for eating and I had no idea of how communal it can be, especially as a believer, finding other believers, and not just believers, but even at another level, those who are of Reformed convictions and who can connect on that level as well. And just what at the same time, horrible and yet blessed time it can be for these guys.
And I think maybe I said this earlier, but just this idea that the Lord disciplines those he loves. And a lot of these guys getting to see that firsthand and seeing prison as the blessing that you never would have expected. Yeah. And just, I'm grateful for prison.
That's amazing.
Like, I mean, it sounds so ridiculous, but people are like, I never would have met Samuel had he not been in prison. Like, there's just a reality that our paths never would have crossed. And so to me, I'm like, yes, like, I'm so grateful and I wouldn't change a thing. His life was hard before he went to prison. And a lot of things happened to him and a lot of just sad things, sad realities of his life. But it's what brought him to the Lord. And I'm so grateful for that. So,
well, at some point, we'll see how it goes. But we'd love to have him in here, have the both of you in here.
Yeah.
Then we can get deeper into some of that story if he wants to. And
Absolutely, yeah.
just hear how, by God's grace, of course, the ministry is developing. And, but yeah, such a powerful story. I'm so glad that you came in. I'm so glad you reached out.
Yeah.
I was like, who's is this?
I told my sister the story and she was like, what are you doing reaching out to people like that? And I was like, well, Samuel needs some resources. And so, it just, it's one of the ways the Lord has changed me through Samuel and has given me just a boldness, I think, that I never had before. And that's such a sweet,
It's funny, you did say you're shy, and I was like, no, you're not. You sent me a long email explaining your story, and I think I made you weren't asking me to be on the podcast.
No.
I made the invitation, but for anybody listening, if you have stories you want to tell or things like that, just send us an email,
Yeah.
We love to talk to people who want to talk about their experience with the Lord, and especially, they're coming into a reformed understanding of God's sovereignty and his nearness, and yet the mystery of faith and all these things that come together with that.
Yeah.
These are good stories.
I really enjoyed the interview you had with Ian Hamilton and just your discussion of the godness of God.
Oh, yeah.
I actually was telling Samuel about it, and he was like, "Oh my goodness, the way that he's talking about that, just discussing the Trinity and how we know Christ more when we know the Trinity, and that reality was really helpful for us too, and we talked about that, and it was just getting us to think more, like stimulating conversation that was really encouraging." So,
well, just so you know, and our listeners know, we are working now on how to get all of our episodes now and in the future onto a format that we can send to Samuel and guys in other prisons too.
Yeah.
Apart from transcripts, that would be fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important that the guys could watch and listen. There's a reason why we bring people into the studio here instead of doing Zoom call. I mean, I guess that was an exception today. That wasn't Zoom. That was a phone call.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Veronica, thank you so much for coming in, making the long drive down.
Yeah.
And we'll get you again in here soon, because it would be great to just hear an update and
love
how
to
things
share.
are going.
For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is a huge blessing to me to share.
Absolutely. Yeah. And afterwards we can figure out some more ways to kind of help support Samuel and the guys as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. Thanks. All right. Thanks, everyone.